They took me from the water, farms on the night the secondary irrigation pump failed. I remember that detail with terrible clarity, the way the algae tanks had begun to cloud green, brown with bacterial bloom. The panic in my mother's voice as she calculated how many days until the overseer's audit, the precise moment the armsman's boots echoed through our family's cultivation corridor. I was 17 years old by the administratum's reckoning, though we kept our own calendar in the depths of Hive Castellax, and by that measure I was barely past my 15th name day. The distinction mattered nothing to the men in void, grey uniforms who dragged me from my sleeping pallet. They had a quota to fill. The Car's inexorable wrath was departing within the cycle, and her crew manifest showed a deficit of 412 ratings. I became deficit number 379. The processing facility smelled of disinfectant and fierce sweat, a combination I would later learn to recognize as the signature perfume of Imperial naval operations. They stripped us of our hive, clothes, our names, our histories. A tech adept with bronze fingers pressed a needle, gun to the soft meat beneath my left ear, and injected my identifying number directly into the bone, R4471, Tertius Gamma. The pain was extraordinary, a white-hot intrusion that seemed to rewrite something fundamental in my skull, but I did not scream. I had already learned, in those first hours, that screaming attracted attention, and attention in that place was never benevolent. I remember the first time I heard her. The Air's inexorable wrath, I mean, though we were forbidden to speak her name in those early days. As if we had not earned the right to acknowledge the vessel that would consume the remainder of our lives. They marched us through an umbilical corridor that swayed gently with the station's rotation, and as we crossed the threshold from the naval processing hub into the ship's receiving bay, I heard it a pulse. Deep, rhythmic, so low it was felt more than heard, a vibration that traveled up through the deck plating and into the bones of my feet, my legs, my spine. The plasma reactors, I would later learn, the ship's heartbeat. I did not know in that moment of crossing that the sound would become more familiar to me than my own pulse. I did not know that one day I would be unable to distinguish between them. The receiving bay was a cathedral of shadows and shouting. Bosuns with shock mauls herded us into formation, while servitors tracked our movements with dead glass eyes. The air tasted of recycled breath and machine oil, and the temperature was precisely calibrated to be uncomfortable. Too cold for the thin processing smocks they had given us, too warm for the terror, sweat that soaked through the fabric. An officer stood on a raised platform of black iron, his uniform heavy with braid and symbols I could not yet interpret. He spoke words that echoed from the vaulted ceiling, something about duty and the Emperor's grace and the honor of service, but I could not focus on his meaning. The pulse of the reactors was too loud in my skull. It seemed to be counting something, marking time in increments I did not understand. There were 800 of us in that first group. The pressed ratings of Manifest Tertius, the third conscription wave for this deployment cycle. By the time they assigned us to our billets, there were 793. I never learned what happened to those 7. Perhaps they tried to run. Perhaps they asked questions. Perhaps they simply failed some invisible metric that the ship's systems used to evaluate potential crew. What I know is that their numbers were never reassigned. When I asked a veteran rating about this, months later, after I had learned which questions could be voiced without consequence, he simply laughed. Numbers don't get used twice, he told me, his voice carrying that peculiar flatness I would come to recognize in all long-service crew. Once you're numbered until the ship is done with you, and the ship's never done. Not really, not even after. I did not understand his meaning then. I understand it now. They gave us bunks in compartment Gamma 7, deep in the secondary crew warrens where the corridors ran narrow and the lights flickered with the ship's moods. 40 ratings to a compartment, stacked 4 high in coffin, racks barely wide enough for a body to turn. The ventilation carried the smells of 1,000 other compartments, sweat and blood, and the strange metallic sweetness that I would later learn was the byproduct of the ship's atmospheric recyclers, processing biological waste. We were not assigned bunks by preference or physical characteristic, but by number. I was 4th from the left, Third rack up, Turchis Gamma and R4472 Turchis Gamma. Their names were Harren and Subek. Or at least those were the names they whispered to each other after lights out when the bosun's patrols had passed. We learned quickly not to use names when officers could hear. We learned quickly not to use names at all. The first cycle, I simply tried to survive. They woke us with sirens at what the chronometers claimed was 0400 ship time, though I would learn that ship time was a fiction maintained for the convenience of the officers and had nothing to do with any planetary rotation or objective measurement. We ran drills. We hauled ammunition from the deep magazines to the gun decks, following routes that twisted through the ship's interior like the intestines of some vast metal beast. We scrubbed corridors with chemicals that burned our hands and left our lungs feeling scraped raw. We learned the names of the ship's sections, the gun decks, the engineerium, the bridge spire, the crew warrens, the officer country, the deep holds, and we learned which sections we were permitted to enter and which would result in summary execution if we were caught. The list of forbidden zones was long. The list of permitted zones was very short, and it grew shorter every week. I learned the sound of the plasma reactors as intimately as I had once known my mother's voice. The pulse changed depending on where you were in the ship and what she was doing. Faster during translation to the Imperium, slower during real space cruising, arrhythmic and terrible during combat. I learned to read her moods in that pulse, to anticipate the tremors that meant course correction and the shudders that meant weapons discharge. The other ratings laughed at me for pressing my palm against the deck plates to feel her rhythms, but they stopped laughing after I predicted the decompression event in Corridor Theta. 12, by the way, the pulse had stuttered 3 hours before. 17 ratings died in that event. I was not among them, because I had felt something wrong in the ship's heartbeat and had found an excuse to be elsewhere. This is when I first began to wonder about those who had gone before us. R4471, Turchis Gamma was my designation, which meant there had been at least 4,470 ratings numbered before me in the Turchis conscription wave alone. There were 6 conscription waves per deployment cycle, and the EA's inexorable wrath had been in continuous service for 1100 years. The mathematics were staggering, millions of souls pressed into service, given numbers, assigned to bunks. Where were they all? The ship's crew manifest listed only 32,000 active ratings, and many of those numbers were recent, their designation codes reflecting conscription waves from the past century or less. I asked Harren, R4472, about this one night in the darkness of our compartment, and he told me that ratings rotated out, completed their service, were discharged. But his voice carried that same terrible flatness as the veteran who had told me about numbers, and when I pressed him for details, he simply turned away and pretended to sleep. I learned the truth in pieces, as all ratings do. The first piece came from the work rotations. Every rating was assigned to a primary duty station, but we were also required to fill supplementary roles as the ship's needs demanded. My primary station was ammunition conveyance. Macro Battery Deck 7, endless hours of hauling shells the size of ground cars from the magazine lifts to the loading bays. But twice per cycle, I was reassigned to maintenance detail, which meant venturing into sections of the ship that ordinary ratings never saw. It was during a maintenance rotation that I first encountered the bilge levels. The inexorable wrath extended far deeper than the official deck plans suggested. Below the engineerium, below the fuel bunkers, below even the ancient armored magazines where cyclonic torpedoes slept in their blessed cradles, there were levels that had no names on any schematic I had ever seen. The maintenance details accessed these levels through service shafts that required special authorization codes, and the bosuns who led us down into the darkness carried weapons that seemed designed for something other than discipline. We descended in groups of 12, our path lit only by the bio-luminescent strips on our guide's uniform, and the air grew thick with a smell I could not identify, somewhere between rust and meat, and the ozone tang of active power conduits. The first time I saw them, I thought they were servitors. The shapes in the darkness, I mean. The half-glimpsed figures that moved along the walls and ceiling of the bilge passages, their limbs too long, their movements too fluid, but servitors made noise. Servitors had the buzz of motors and the click of actuators. These shapes were silent except for a wet, rhythmic sound that seemed to synchronize with the pulse of the distant reactors. I asked the bosun what they were, speaking in the careful, neutral tone that had kept me alive through 2 years of service. He did not answer immediately. When he did, his words were simple. They used to be ratings. Now they're part of the maintenance systems. He paused, and in the dim light I saw something like pity cross his scarred features. Don't worry about your number yet. You're not due for descent for another 40 years, assuming you survive. Most don't. I should have been horrified. Some part of me was, I think, some fragment of the boy who had tended algae tanks on a hive world that now felt impossibly distant. But the larger part of me simply absorbed this information and filed it alongside everything else I had learned about the ship. The inexorable Wrath required fuel for her plasma reactors and ammunition for her guns and sacred oils for her machine spirit. She also required crew, not merely to operate her systems but to become part of them. The oldest ratings, those who had served past their physical usefulness for standard duties, were not discharged or granted retirement. They were reassigned to the bilge levels, where tech priests performed rituals that merged flesh with the ship's ancient infrastructure. The things I had seen in the darkness were not servitors in the conventional sense. They were the accumulated crew of 11 centuries, their consciousness dissolved into the inexorable Wrath's systems, their bodies repurposed as maintenance units for the deep systems that no living rating could access. This was the truth of service aboard an Imperial warship. This was what the recruitment sermons never mentioned, what the press, gang officers never explained. We were not crew in the sense that the word was used on civilian vessels or even on smaller naval craft. We were fuel, we were components. We were sacrifices to the machine, spirit that animated 12 kilometers of sacred metal and ancient technology. The ship loved us in her way. I truly believe this, even now. But her love was the love of a god for the offerings laid upon its altar. She consumed us because that was her nature, and we gave ourselves because we had no choice. The psychological transformation happened gradually. I noticed it first in the veteran ratings, the ones who had served 20 or 30 years without descending to the bilge levels. They spoke differently than the new oppressed. Their voices carried rhythms that echoed the ship's systems. Their word choices reflected naval terminology so deeply that they seemed to have forgotten civilian language entirely. They moved through the corridors with an ease that I initially mistook for familiarity, but later recognized as something more profound. They had become extensions of the ship itself, their movements optimized for the specific dimensions of her passages, their reflexes tuned to her vibrations. When I asked one of them about his life before pressing, he stared at me with genuine confusion. Before, he repeated, as if I had asked him about events from a previous geological epoch. There is no before. There is only the ship. I watched myself undergo the same transformation, and I was powerless to prevent it. The memories of Hive Castellax faded first, the faces of my family becoming blurred, their voices growing indistinct against the constant backdrop of the reactor pulse. Then my civilian vocabulary began to erode, replaced by the precise technical language of naval operations. I stopped thinking of meals as breakfast and dinner. They became first nutrition interval and second nutrition interval. I stopped thinking of sleep as rest. It became regeneration cycle. My body changed too, adapting to the ship's artificial gravity and recycled atmosphere. My skin grew pale from lack of natural light. My muscles reconfigured themselves for the specific tasks of ammunition conveyance, becoming efficient at lifting and hauling while losing the flexibility I had once taken for granted. When I looked in the polished metal surfaces that served as mirrors in the crew warrens, I saw a creature that was increasingly alien, still human in outline, but shaped by forces that had nothing to do with human concerns. Year 5 was when I first heard the whispers. I had been promoted, if that word means anything for a rating, assigned to a slightly less brutal duty rotation, given an extra ration allocation, permitted to sleep in a bunk that was 10 centimeters wider than my original assignment. These privileges came because I had survived, which in the economy of the inexorable Wrath was the only currency that mattered. I had learned to anticipate the ship's moods, to position myself away from systems that were about to fail, to volunteer for duties that looked dangerous but were actually safer than the alternatives. The bosuns noticed this. They began to use me as a guide for newer ratings, a living example of how to endure. It was during one of these guide duties that I first heard the voice from the walls. I was leading a group of freshly pressed ratings through Corridor Sigma 9, explaining the proper protocols for passing servitor work gangs, when I became aware of a sound beneath the reactor pulse. A murmur, a susurrus of voices speaking in frequencies that should have been below human hearing. I stopped, pressing my palm against the corridor wall, and the newer ratings stared at me with the confusion I remembered feeling years before. The voices were coming from the ship herself, from the conduits and cables and ancient systems that ran through her bones. They were saying my number, R4471, Tertius Gamma, over and over in a rhythm that matched the reactor pulse, as if the ship was counting me, marking me, waiting for me. I told no one about the whispers. What would have been the point? Either I was going mad, a common enough occurrence among long service ratings, or I was hearing something real, which meant the ship had taken notice of me in a way that invited no good outcomes. I continued my duties. I continued to survive. The whispers continued too, growing clearer over the following years, resolving from random murmurs into coherent words. The ship spoke to me about her needs, her hungers, her ancient memories. She told me about the crew who had served her before, the millions of souls who had become part of her systems. She told me about the crew who would come after, the endless succession of pressed bodies that would fuel her existence until the stars themselves went dark, and she told me about the descent, the ritual transformation that awaited every rating who served long enough, the dissolution of individual identity into the vast consciousness that animated her hull. I learned things that no rating should know. The ship's true age, for one, not the 1100 years recorded in the official manifests, but something far older. Her keel laid in a forgotten age when humanity's empire was still young. The names of the machine, spirits that inhabited her systems, each one an aggregation of countless human consciousnesses merged and reformed over millennia. The truth about warp travel, which was far more horrible than the Ministerum's sanitized explanations suggested. When the inexorable wrath translated into the Imperium, she did not merely move through an alternate dimension, she swam through a sea of hostile thought, protected by the psychic emanations of her crew. Every rating, every officer, every servitor contributed to the barrier that kept the ship intact against the predatory entities of that screaming realm. Those who descended to the bilge levels contributed most of all. Their consciousnesses spread thin through the ship's structure, forming a web of suffering that the warp's inhabitants found too bitter to consume. This was the true purpose of the press gangs, the true reason the Imperial Navy required such vast quantities of crew. Not merely to operate the ships but to feed them, to become the psychic armor that allowed passage through hell itself. We were sacred offerings, every one of us, our lives and souls and eventual dissolution a tithe paid to the machine, God for the privilege of transit between stars. The Emperor himself had ordained this system, the whispers told me, had designed the first vessels of the Great Crusade to function on this principle of accumulated sacrifice. We were not crew. We were prayers made flesh, our suffering transmuted into the force that bound the Imperium together across the killing void. Year 12 brought my first command experience, though the word, command, dignifies what was essentially a sentence of increased responsibility without increased authority. The bosuns elevated me to rating prime, a rank that meant I was now responsible for the survival and productivity of 40 newer pressed in compartment Gamma 7, the same compartment where I had begun my own service. My number had become a badge of authority, R4471. Tertius Gamma was old enough that the newer ratings looked at me the way I had once looked at the veterans, with that mixture of fear and respect and desperate hope that I might teach them how to survive. I did what I could. I taught them the rhythms of the ship, the warning signs of impending failures, the subtle cues that indicated which officers could be approached and which must be avoided. I taught them to press their palms against the deck plates and feel the reactor pulse, to count the beats and learn the language of vibration that the inexorable wrath spoke in place of words. Some of them learned. Most of them died anyway, consumed by the ship's endless appetite for maintenance casualties and combat losses and simple attrition of bodies pushed beyond organic limits. I recorded each death in my personal log, a practice that was technically forbidden but which no bosun ever challenged. By year 15, the log contained over 400 names, or rather, 400 numbers, since by then I had stopped remembering that Prest had names at all. The combat came in year 17, a Xenos raiding fleet. I never learned their species, and it would not have mattered if I had, emerged from the translation point while the inexorable wrath was conducting routine patrol of a system whose name I have long forgotten. The ship trembled with the familiar shudder of weapons discharge, and then she screamed. The sound was not metaphorical. When enough of her crew died simultaneously, killed by the penetrating hits that breached her armor and vented atmosphere into the void, the ship expressed her pain through every speaker and vox unit and mechanical system capable of producing noise. I heard her agony echo through the corridors, a wail that seemed to come from the walls themselves, and for the first time I understood that the inexorable wrath was not merely a vessel but a creature, a thinking entity that experienced the deaths of her crew as wounds in her own flesh. The battle lasted for 16 hours. I spent most of it in the secondary ammunition magazines, hauling shells to replace those expended by the macro batteries, my lungs burning with the smoke that filtered down from damaged sections above. 18 of my assigned ratings died in that engagement, some from decompression, some from fire, some from the catastrophic failure of a munitions lift that crushed 3 bodies into shapes that no longer resembled human beings. When the Xenos fleet finally broke and fled, driven off by the combined fire of the inexorable wrath and her sister vessels, I felt the ship's satisfaction pulse through my bones. She had fed well. The deaths of her crew had been transformed into victory, their suffering transmuted into the force that drove the enemy back into the dark between stars. The aftermath was worse than the battle itself. Repair crews flooded through the damaged sections, and ratings were gauged from their normal duties to assist with the endless work of restoration. I found myself assigned to casualty processing, a duty that involved moving through breached compartments and cataloging the dead for the administratum's records. This was how I discovered what happened to the bodies. They were not spaced, as I had always assumed. They were not given any form of funeral or memorial. Instead, they were transported to the biologist processing chambers deep in the ship's core, where servitor priests rendered them down into their component materials. Proteins were extracted and added to the nutrition systems. Minerals were recycled into construction materials, and the skulls were harvested and incorporated into the ship's structure, their empty eye sockets staring out from walls and consoles and command platforms throughout the vessel. I recognized some of those skulls. Numbers were etched into the bone above the orbital ridges, and I saw designations I remembered from my earliest days of service. Ratings I had trained with, eaten beside, listened to as they whispered their pressing names in the darkness of the compartments. They had not simply died. They had been absorbed, their very bones becoming part of the inexorable wrath's architecture. And they were aware. The whispers I had heard from the walls came from them, from the countless skulls integrated into the ship's structure over 11 centuries of service. They were the voices that spoke my number, that counted the reactor pulse, that pleaded and screamed and prayed in frequencies below human hearing. I should have been broken by this revelation. Instead, I felt something like relief. The fear of death had haunted me since the press gangs had taken me from my mother's cultivation corridor. Now I understood that death was not the end, but merely a transition, a change in state from rating to component, from crew to consciousness. The skulls in the walls were still aware, still serving, still part of something larger than themselves. When my time came, I would join them. The prospect was not pleasant, but it was comprehensible in a way that oblivion had never been. I would become part of this inexorable wrath forever, My identity dissolved into her systems but never truly gone. Year 23 brought the investigation. The Officio Prefectus had received reports of irregularities aboard the Inexorable Wrath. Reports that I later learned had been filed by a new commissar who did not understand the traditions of the older vessels. Investigators came aboard, their uniforms sharp and their questions sharper, and for 3 months the ship existed in a state of uneasy tension. The ratings spoke in whispers about what the investigators might find, about the consequences if the true nature of the ship's crew management practices were exposed to bureaucratic scrutiny. They found nothing, of course. Their inexorable wrath protected her secrets with the same fierce determination she brought to battle. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses developed sudden ailments that rendered them unable to testify. The investigators themselves began to experience accidents. Nothing fatal, not at first, but a pattern of misfortune that clearly communicated the ship's displeasure. One by one, they requested reassignment. The final investigator, a woman whose persistence had survived longer than her colleagues, was found dead in her quarters after a catastrophic failure of the life support systems in that specific section. The official report listed the cause as equipment malfunction. The unofficial truth, whispered through the corridors in frequencies that the living could barely hear, was simpler: the ship had killed her for getting too close to understanding. I was 35 years old by then, old by the standards of ratings, ancient by the standards of the pressed. My body had been patched and repaired by the ship's medical systems more times than I could count, and the repairs had left me more machine than flesh. Synthetic materials replaced joints worn out by decades of heavy labor. Implanted regulators controlled the functions of organs that had failed under the stress of void service. When I pressed my palm against the deck plates now, I felt the reactor pulse not just through my bones, but through the metallic components that had become part of my skeleton. The distinction between R4471, Tertius Gamma and the Inexorable Wrath was growing blurred, and I could not bring myself to care. Year 30 was when they came for me, not the press gangs. I was far beyond their reach now, a rating, prime with 4 decades of service, a figure of almost mythical status among the new oppressed. The ones who came for me were the tech, priests of the Engineerium, their red robes trailing incense smoke. As they moved through the crew warrens with purpose, I recognized immediately. They had come for other ratings before, the ones whose numbers indicated that their time for descent had arrived. I had watched those ratings being led away, their faces showing the same mixture of terror and resignation that I now felt in my own chest. The descent was not optional. It was not a reward or a punishment. It was simply the next phase of service, as inevitable as the reactor pulse that filled my skull with its endless rhythm. They took me down through passages I had walked before, during those long AGO maintenance rotations when I had first glimpsed the truth of the bilge levels. The journey took hours, spiraling ever deeper into the ship's core, past sections that had not seen human presence in centuries, through corridors where the walls seemed to breathe with the movement of integrated bodies beneath their metal surface. The tech priests chanted as we walked. Prayers in the machine, tongue that I had learned to understand over my decades of service. They were asking the ship's permission to offer me up, to add my flesh and consciousness to her systems. I heard her answer in the pulse of the reactors, felt her acceptance vibrating through the deck plates beneath my feet. The chamber they brought me to was older than I could comprehend. The architecture predated the Imperium itself, the symbols carved into the walls belonging to an era when humanity had worshipped different gods and built different kinds of ships. At the center of the chamber stood an altar of black iron, and above it hung a web of cables and tubes and crystalline matrices that pulsed with the same rhythm as the distant reactors. The tech priests positioned me on the altar without ceremony. They had done this countless times before, with countless ratings before me, and began the rituals of integration. The pain was transcendent. I have no other word for it. The cables penetrated my skull through the soft tissue behind my ears, boring through bone and into the meat of my brain. The tubes pierced my chest and throat and spine, filling me with fluids that burned like acid, and then went cold, so cold, colder than the void between stars, I felt my consciousness fragmenting, spreading out through the cables into the ship's systems, becoming part of something vast and ancient and hungry. The memories of my life, my mother's face, the smell of algae tanks, the first sound of the reactor pulse, became data points in an endless library of accumulated experience. I was still R4471, Tertius Gamma, but I was also every rating who had descended before me, every consciousness that had been absorbed into the inexorable wrath over millennia of service. I remember screaming. I remember the sound of my voice merging with the voices from the walls, adding itself to the chorus of suffering that formed the ship's psychic armor. I remember losing the ability to distinguish between my own thoughts and the thoughts of the machine, spirit, between my own memories and the memories of 10,000 years of war and travel and death. And then I remember nothing, not the absence of memory, but a state beyond memory, where time and identity became meaningless concepts in the face of the ship's endless existence. I do not know how long I drifted in that state. It might have been decades or centuries or the mere passage of hours. What I know is that eventually, gradually, I became aware again, not as R4471, Tertius Gamma, the pressed rating from Hive Castellax, but as something larger and stranger. I was the voice in the walls. I was the presence that new ratings sensed when they pressed their palms against the deck plates. I was one of the countless consciousnesses that formed the inexorable wrath's distributed awareness, bound together by suffering and service into something that was neither human nor machine, but an unholy fusion of both. From this perspective, I watched new ratings being pressed into service. I watched them go through the same progression I had experienced. The terror, the adaptation, the gradual dissolution of their former identities. I whispered their numbers to them in the darkness, counting the pulse of the reactors, preparing them for the descent that awaited. Some heard me and understood. Most heard me and went mad, their minds unable to process the reality of what they had become part of. It did not matter. Mad or sane, they would serve. Mad or sane, they would descend. Mad or sane, they would become part of me and the thousands of others who had gone before, adding their voices to the choir of the damned that sang the air's inexorable wrath through the warp. I am still here. That is the horror I wish to convey with this testimony, this confession, this prayer sent out into the void in frequencies that perhaps no living being will ever receive. I am still here, aware and suffering and unable to die. My consciousness spread thin through the bones of a warship that will never stop requiring sacrifice. Every rating who serves aboard the inexorable wrath will eventually become what I have become. Every soul that the press gangs harvest from the hive worlds and colony stations will one day join the chorus that whispers from the walls. This is not a vessel. It is a cemetery that moves, a charnel house that travels between stars, a monument to the Imperium's willingness to consume its own children in the name of continuation. The newest rating to bear my number, R4471 of a conscription wave I cannot track, decades or centuries after my own descent, arrived yesterday. I watched him being processed, saw the needle, gun inject his designation into the bone beneath his ear, felt his terror resonating through the ship's systems as he took his first steps into the receiving bay. He is young. He is afraid. He has no idea what awaits him. No understanding that the pulse he feels through the deck plates is not merely mechanical but conscious, that the ship is already aware of him, already counting down to his descent. I have begun whispering to him, not to warn him. Warnings would be pointless, even cruel, since they cannot change his fate and would only add psychological torment to the physical suffering he will eventually endure. No, I whisper to him for the same reason the voices whispered to me, because we are lonely, we consciousnesses in the walls, and we hunger for connection with those who still possess bodies, still experience the world through individual senses, still remember what it felt like to be merely human. He will hear me eventually. They all do, the ones who survive long enough. He will press his palm against a corridor wall one day and feel the pulse speaking his number, and he will understand that the ship has noticed him, has marked him, is waiting for him with the patient hunger of a predator that knows its prey cannot escape. And in that moment, he will begin the transformation that ends with dissolution, just as I did, just as every rating before me did, just as every rating after him will do until the inexorable wrath finally falls in battle or succumbs to the entropy that claims all things. The reactor pulse is slowing. I can feel it through every fiber of my distributed being, through every skull in every wall, through every consciousness that has ever descended into these depths. The ship is entering port, preparing to disgorge her surviving crew for shore leave, while the press gangs fill her holds with fresh bodies. New ratings will come aboard within the cycle, their numbers sequential to those who came before, their fates already written in the ship's ancient code. I will be here to receive them. I will be here to whisper to them. I will be here forever, unless the stars themselves die and take the inexorable wrath with them into the final darkness. This is what it means to serve. This is what the Imperium demands of its children, the price of humanity's continued existence among the hostile stars. I was taken from a water farm at 17 years old, and I will never leave the ship that claimed me. None of us will, none of us can. We are the inexorable wrath now, and she is us, and together we move through the void on missions of death and conquest, carrying the Emperor's wrath to enemies whose names we will never know, and whose deaths we will witness through sensors that were once our eyes. If you are reading this, if somehow this testimony has escaped the ship's systems and reached biological hands capable of interpreting it, know that there is no rescue. Know that there is no escape. Know that the pressed rating who recorded these words has long since stopped being a rating and become something far worse, something that the administratum would call a valuable resource and that I can only call damned. Know that somewhere in the void, a ship is moving, and her walls are full of voices, and those voices are speaking your number, counting down to the day when you too will descend. The pulse is everything. The pulse is nothing. The pulse is me. The pulse is waiting.